Welcome to the podcast to preserve, protect, and defend the soul of America. I'm Alex.
And I'm Sam.
The topic we shall discuss in today's show, American food safety jurisdictional fragmentation.
It's quite the mouthful of a topic, isn't it?
It really is. And, we are also going to be pulling apart the themes from the source material, which is specifically subtitled American Food Safety's Deliberately Fragmented Regulatory Architecture and the Political Economy of What Americans Eat.
Right, which sounds incredibly academic, I know.
Yeah, it does. But we want to welcome you, the listener, to this deep dive into the text. Our mission today is to uncover this invisible and honestly, often completely absurd political economy that dictates exactly what ends up on your dinner plate every single night.
Exactly, because it affects all of us.
It does. But before your eyes glaze over at words like jurisdictional fragmentation, I want you to picture yourself just standing in the freezer aisle of your local grocery store.
Okay, I'm there. It's chilly.
Right. And you are holding a frozen pepperoni pizza.
Classic choice.
Yeah. Now, you probably aren't thinking about the federal government when you're looking at that box, but that single piece of frozen dough, the cheese, the cured meat, it's actually the center of a turf war. So absurd, so perfectly bureaucratic, that the rules governing its existence literally change if the manufacturer decides to make the crust just a fraction of an inch thicker.
It honestly sounds like a bad joke.
Right.
But the reality behind the curtain to the American food system is something that fundamentally impacts the safety of every single calorie you consume.
Yeah.
We are just so deeply accustomed to trusting the label on a package or, glancing at a stamp from a federal agency and just assuming someone somewhere is looking out for us.
We take it totally for granted.
We really do. We rarely stop to ask how those agencies actually divide up their responsibilities, or, more importantly, why the rules are written the way they are.
Oh, absolutely.
Because, spoiler alert, they weren't primarily written with your health in mind.
Okay, let's unpack this right out of the gate with that frozen pizza scenario, because I think it perfectly illustrates the madness of the system. Policy scholars actually refer to this as the pepperoni pizza problem.
Yes, a very famous problem in food policy circles.
Right, so let's say you are a food manufacturer. You make a standard, thin crust, frozen pepperoni pizza, you box it up, ship it across state lines, and it lands in that grocery store freezer.
Makes sense.
In the United States, that specific pizza falls entirely under the regulatory jurisdiction of the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA. They inspect your facility, they review your hazard prevention plans, they are the boss.
Right. They handle the oversight.
But if you take that exact same recipe, the exact same flour, the exact same tomatoes, the exact same pepperoni, and you just make the crust thicker. And you arrange those toppings in a specific architectural way so that it stops looking like a flat pie and starts looking more like a piece of bread with meat on top. Federal regulators might suddenly categorize it as an open-faced meat sandwich.
And that is where everything goes off the rails. Because the absolute second the categorization shifts from pizza to sandwich, the entire regulatory universe shifts right along with it.
The FDA is just out.
Completely out.
Yeah.
Jurisdiction moves away from the FDA and lands squarely on the desk of the United States Department of Agriculture.
The USDA.
Specifically, their Food Safety and Inspection Service. But yeah, the USDA.
That is wild. It is the exact same ingredients.
Exactly the same.
It is going into the exact same human being's stomach. The potential for harm, like if the pepperoni is contaminated with listeria or the cheese has salmonella, is identical.
Yep, the biological risk doesn't change.
But as a manufacturer, you are now dealing with two completely different agencies, two entirely different inspection regimes, different paperwork, different frequency of inspector visits. It's just two different sets of standards born from entirely different historical contexts.
It is staggering when you really look at the logistics of it.
I was trying to think of how to describe this, and it's like having two different sets of building inspectors for a house you're trying to construct. But one inspector only cares about the living room.
Right.
And the other inspector only cares about the hallway. And they use different rule books, they demand different blueprints, and they absolutely refuse to share notes with each other.
That analogy is great, but it honestly undersells the chaos.
Really? How could it be worse?
Because if you are a food manufacturer making both of those products in the same facility, you might literally have to build separate physical rooms to satisfy the differing inspector requirements.
You're kidding. Separate rooms.
Separate rooms, separate walls.
Yeah.
And what's really fascinating here is how the numbers break down when you look at this split on a macro level across the whole country.
Okay, break down the numbers for me.
The FDA regulates about 80% of the American food supply by economic value.
80%. That's a massive chunk.
It is. That 80% includes all seafood, all fresh produce, dairy, shell eggs, grains, most packaged and processed foods, dietary supplements, and yes, your standard cheese or thin pepperoni pizzas.
Okay, so the FDA is the heavyweight.
Well, hang on. The USDA, on the other hand, handles about 20% of the food supply by value.
So they're the minority player.
But, and this is a crucial distinction, that 20% accounts for roughly 45% of the food consumed by weight.
Wait, really? By weight?
Yes, by weight, because their specific domain is the heavy stuff. We're talking beef, pork, lamb, poultry, and certain processed egg products like liquid eggs in a carton.
Okay, I have to stop you there because the boundaries you're describing sound incredibly arbitrary to me.
Oh, they are?
Like if I go to the store and buy a can of chicken noodle soup, who regulates that?
That is FDA territory.
Okay, but what if I buy a can of chicken broth? It's literally just the liquid version of the same thing.
Well, if that chicken broth happens to have just enough chicken solids in it to cross a very specific, legally defined weight threshold, it suddenly becomes USDA territory.
That makes absolutely no sense. How does the amount of chicken solid fundamentally change the biological risk profile of a sealed, pasteurized can of broth?
It doesn't.
Or, oh, think about a corn dog. I remember reading this in the source material and having my mind completely blown.
Oh, the corn dog rule.
Yes, a corn dog has a hot dog inside, which is meat, but the corn batter on the outside is a substantial portion of the product. So technically, a corn dog should be an FDA product, right?
Right.
But wait, if the hot dog inside that batter constitutes more than 3% of the finished product by weight, boom, it's a USDA product again, 3%.
The 3% rule is one of the most notorious examples of this jurisdictional fragmentation.
It's just laughable.
It is. But this administrative overhead isn't just a quirky thing for policy wonks to laugh at cocktail parties. It creates massive, compounding, real-world burdens.
I can imagine.
Just picture yourself running a food manufacturing plant. You literally have to employ dedicated compliance teams, highly paid lawyers, and regulatory specialists whose sole function in life is to navigate this specific maze.
Just to deal with the government.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
They have to figure out if your new frozen burrito, which is usually USDA because it's stuffed with beef or chicken, needs to be handled on a completely different production line with totally different cleaning protocols than your new vegetarian bean burrito.
Which would be FDA.
Exactly, because it has no meat.
Right, and let's think about who actually pays for that. Because if you are a massive multinational food corporation like a Kraft Heinz or a General Mills,
Right.
you can easily afford a floor of lawyers and compliance officers to manage that. It's basically a rounding error in your annual budget.
Absolutely, they don't even blink.
But what if you are a smaller business? What if you are a regional producer in Ohio trying to scale up and sell your grandmother's famous meat-stuffed ravioli across state lines?
You're in for a world of pain.
Right. This bureaucratic maze disproportionately hurts the smaller players who just cannot absorb those dedicated compliance costs.
Yeah.
You're bleeding venture capital or small business loans just trying to figure out which government building in Washington, D.C. to send your paperwork to. Yeah. And that's well before you've even started worrying about the actual literal safety of the food you are producing.
That's the tragedy of it.
It feels like a system designed to crush the little guy.
It acts as an incredible barrier to entry, whether it was explicitly designed that way or not. And this raises an incredibly important question, which the text tackles head on.
Okay, what is it?
If the current system makes absolutely no logical sense from a risk assessment perspective or a public health perspective or even an economic efficiency perspective, how did it get built this way?
That is the million-dollar question.
Right, because if you sat down with a blank piece of paper today and asked a panel of smart scientists to design a food safety system, they would never, ever draw the Venn diagram we currently have.
Not in a million years.
The source material makes it very clear that this wasn't designed from first principles. It was cobbled together through a series of political compromises. And to understand why, we really have to go back in time to a very specific year, which is 1906.
1906. Yeah, this is where the history gets deeply, darkly fascinating for me. 1906 is the year everything fractured into the two-headed monster we have today.
It's ground zero.
But to understand the sheer shock of 1906, We have to look at the landscape of the 19th century leading up to it. It was basically the Wild West for food.
Oh, absolutely.
And I mean that literally. There were almost no federal rules whatsoever.
None.
We're talking about an era before widespread commercial refrigeration. So how do you keep milk from spoiling as you transport it from a rural farm to a growing industrial city?
You really don't.
Exactly, you don't. It spoils. And then the distributors would pour chalk or plaster of Paris into the spoiled, bluish, watered-down milk to make it look white and creamy again.
It's disgusting.
It is. They were coloring children's candy with lead chromate just to make it a vibrant yellow. They were preserving rotting meat with formaldehyde, which is literally the same chemical used to embalm corpses.
The level of food adulteration was staggering, and the public health consequences were severe, particularly for infant mortality.
I can only imagine.
So, enter a man named Harvey Washington Wiley. He was the chief chemist of the Bureau of Chemistry, which was just this tiny, totally underfunded office within the government at the time.
Okay.
Wiley was a scientist, but he was also a master showman. He was so desperate to prove to the American public and to a very reluctant Congress just how dangerous the food supply actually was.
He had to get their attention somehow.
Right, so he created something called the Poison Squad.
I cannot get over the Poison Squad. It sounds like a comic book, but it was real life.
It is very real.
Huh.
Wiley recruited healthy young men, mostly his own government clerks and colleagues, actually. And he had them volunteer to eat meals prepared in a special kitchen. These meals were intentionally laced with the exact chemical preservatives that the food industry was using at the time.
That is insane.
We're talking about feeding them borax, salicylic acid, formaldehyde, and copper sulfate.
Just casually serving up copper sulfate for dinner.
Yeah, and the volunteers were intensely monitored. They tracked their weight, their temperature, their urine, their feces.
So they were literally human guinea pigs for toxic waste. And he did this just to generate public outrage.
Well, he did it to generate undeniable scientific data, but the public outrage was the vehicle to force political change.
Ah, I see.
It was an incredible piece of early public relations and scientific advocacy. Newspapers covered the Poison Squad obsessively. The public was horrified as they read these daily reports of these young men falling violently ill, suffering terrible stomach cramps, and losing massive amounts of weight.
It's so dramatic, but I guess it worked.
It did. Wiley spent decades using this data to fight a powerful coalition of liquor distillers, patent medicine manufacturers, and food processors who absolutely loved the lack of federal oversight.
Of course they did. It was profitable for them.
But the political tipping point didn't actually arrive until 1906. And crucially, it arrived via two completely different impulses from two different sectors of society.
Okay.
And these two impulses birthed two completely different laws on the exact same day.
Right, so let's break down those two impulses. First, you have Wiley's years of scientific advocacy finally paying off.
Exactly.
This led to the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. This law was fundamentally driven by a consumer protection impulse. The goal was to stop companies from lying on their labels and putting actual literal poison in the food.
Spot on.
And the enforcement of this act was handed to Wiley's Bureau of Chemistry, which decades later would evolve into the FDA.
Exactly. The Pure Food and Drug Act is the core DNA of the FDA. But at the exact same time, in the exact same year, you had a completely different cultural bombshell drop on the American public. Upton Sinclair published his famous novel, The Jungle.
Oh, right. Sinclair actually went undercover in the meatpacking plants in Chicago, right?
He did. He was a socialist.
Yeah.
And he was originally trying to write a book about the horrific labor conditions and the brutal exploitation of immigrant workers in the packing houses.
He wanted a labor movement.
Right. He wanted to spark a labor revolution. But what the American public actually latched onto were his visceral, stomach-churning descriptions of the meat itself.
Yeah, people care a lot more about what goes in their mouths than how the workers are treated, sadly.
Exactly. He described rats overrunning the meat piles, workers sweeping rat feces and poisoned rat beat right into the sausage grinders, and diseased cattle being butchered and sold directly to the public.
It's repulsive.
It is. Sinclair famously said later, "I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident I hit it in the stomach."
That quote is so perfect. People were beyond disgusted. They were absolutely terrified.
They were.
The story goes that President Theodore Roosevelt was actually reading the book while eating breakfast, and he was so revolted he threw his sausages out the window and immediately demanded an investigation.
A very Roosevelt reaction.
Very much so. And when his own investigators confirmed that Sinclair's descriptions were actually accurate, Roosevelt pushed Congress to pass the Federal Meat Inspection Act, also in 1906.
Now, here is where the jurisdictional split begins, and this is so important. The Pure Food and Drug Act went to the Bureau of Chemistry, the future FDA.
Okay.
But the Federal Meat Inspection Act, that was placed under the authority of the USDA.
Which was a totally different department.
Yes.
Yeah.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to deeply analyze the USDA's original statutory mandate.
Okay, let's look at that.
The USDA wasn't created in 1906. It was actually created decades earlier by Abraham Lincoln in 1862.
Oh, wow, I didn't know it was that old.
Yeah, and it was created with one explicit goal: to promote American agriculture. Lincoln called it the People's Department because so many Americans were farmers at the time.
That makes sense.
So from the very beginning of the Meat Inspection Act, you have the USDA carrying a severe dual mandate.
A dual mandate.
Right. On one hand, they are now required to police the meat industry and ensure the safety of agricultural products.
Okay.
But on the other hand, their foundational existential purpose as a government agency is to promote the financial interests and market growth of American agriculture.
Let's stop and really look at that, because that is a massive structural conflict of interest.
It's huge.
You were telling the exact same agency to act as the strict police officer for an industry and simultaneously to act as its chief marketing and sales department. You just cannot be both the referee and the cheerleader.
It's an impossible position.
And according to the analysis in the source material, when those two missions conflict, like when public safety demands something that might hurt the financial bottom line of the meat industry, promotion almost always wins.
Almost every single time. It is an inherent flaw in the architecture of the system.
Yeah.
But to really understand the political economy of this, we have to look at how the meat industry itself reacted to this new law in 1906. The text highlights a highly counterintuitive, honestly almost brilliant strategic pivot from the major meat packers.
Okay, what did they do?
Initially, the massive Chicago meat conglomerate, they were called the Beef Trust, they fought the regulations fiercely. They did not want government inspectors in their plants.
Naturally.
But very quickly, their corporate strategists realized something profound. They realized that federal inspection wasn't just a regulatory burden. It could actually act as a government-funded, government-certified seal of quality.
Oh, interesting.
And more importantly, it could open up highly lucrative foreign markets, particularly in Europe, which had started banning American meat because it was so notoriously diseased.
Wait. I have a hard time believing massive turn-of-the-century monopolies actively beg for government agents to walk into their slaughterhouses. That goes against every rule of ruthless capitalism we are taught about the Gilded Age.
It does seem backwards.
What is the catch here? Why would they embrace all that red tape?
The catch is the competitive landscape. The heavyweights realized that high regulatory compliance costs act as an incredible, insurmountable barrier to entry for their smaller competitors.
Oh, wow.
Think about it. The big Chicago Packers had massive capital reserves. They could easily afford to upgrade their facilities to meet the new baseline sanitation requirements. They could afford to build the special offices for the federal inspectors, which the new law actually required.
Right.
But the small, regional, mom-and-pop slaughterhouses scattered all across the country. They could not afford those upgrades. They couldn't afford the downtime to remodel.
I see where this is going.
So, regulation, when captured and shaped by the largest players in an industry, ceases to be about consumer protection. It transforms into a competitive weapon that clears the playing field of smaller rivals.
That is ruthless.
The big meat packers ultimately supported the 1906 law because it forced the government to pay the salaries of the inspectors, it gave them a stamp of approval to sell to Europe, and it bankrupted their pesky small-town competition.
That is deeply cynical, but from a ruthless business perspective, it is incredibly effective. They effectively used the public's genuine outrage and fear over food safety to build a permanent, federally funded moat around their own monopolies.
Exactly.
And the strategy, this idea of weaponizing food safety regulation to destroy your economic competitors, it didn't just happen in the progressive era and then go away.
Not at all.
It is baked into the system. Fast forward exactly a century, and we see this tactic perfected into an absolute art form. I am talking about what policy experts call the catfish wars.
The catfish wars are perhaps the most illuminating, just naked case study in the entire source text regarding how bureaucracy is weaponized for economic gain.
It's a crazy story.
It really is. This saga played out starting in the early 2000s, and it perfectly illustrates the intersection of global trade and domestic regulatory manipulation.
So set the scene for us.
Here is the setup. American catfish farming is a massive industry, but it is heavily geographically concentrated in the southern United States,
Right.
specifically in Mississippi, Arkansas, Alabama, and Louisiana.
Right.
It's a huge economic driver and a major source of employment in those states. But in the early 2000s, after trade relations fully normalized between the U.S. and Vietnam, Vietnamese aquaculture producers started aggressively exporting a fish called Pangasius to the U.S. market.
Now, Pangasius is biologically very similar to the American channel catfish.
Exactly. Ecologically and gastronomically, they are incredibly similar. They have the same mild, white, flaky meat that fries up perfectly in a cornmeal batter.
Right, which is what people want when they order catfish.
Yes. From a consumer's perspective, eating at a restaurant, they are virtually indistinguishable. But here is the critical difference. The Vietnamese producers could raise, process, freeze, and ship Pangasius across the Pacific Ocean at a dramatically lower cost than the American farmers could produce catfish in Mississippi.
So the American industry was suddenly facing an existential threat from significantly cheaper imports.
Yes.
A classic globalization story. But the American catfish farmers couldn't just go to Congress and say, hey, we don't like capitalism and free trade when we're the ones losing.
No, they can't say that out loud.
They couldn't just admit they were being outcompeted on price. They had to get creative. They needed a smokescreen.
A very thick smokescreen.
And the source material outlines this incredible, relentless, three-pronged attack launched by the industry lobbying group, the Catfish Farmers of America.
Right.
First, they went after the linguistics, the labeling. They furiously lobbied Congress and the FDA to declare that Vietnamese Pangasius could no longer legally be called catfish when sold in the United States.
Which is biologically absurd because both the American channel catfish and the Vietnamese Pangasius belong to the exact same biological order, Siluriformes.
And they're cousins.
They're evolutionary cousins. But the lobbying worked. The U.S. government mandated that the imported fish could only be marketed under names like sway or basa.
It was a blatant attempt to make the imported fish sound foreign, weird, and less appetizing to American consumers who were used to seeing catfish on the menu.
Exactly.
But here's the amazing part. That labeling war didn't completely stop the bleeding. Consumers and restaurants realized pretty quickly that sway tasted great and cost half as much. So the imported fish kept flooding in.
Yep, the market adapted.
Okay, so prong one fails to stop the imports. What does the industry do? They move to prong two, brute force economics, anti-dumping tariffs.
The heavy artillery.
They convinced the Department of Commerce to slap massive duties on Vietnamese imports, arguing that the Vietnamese were unfairly subsidizing their industry and dumping fish below cost. We are talking about tariffs that ranged from 36 to an astronomical 64%.
But incredibly, the Vietnamese aquaculture system was so efficient and their labor and environmental costs were so low that even with the 64% tax tacked onto their product, they still remain highly competitive in the American wholesale market.
Which brings us to the masterstroke, prong three, the nuclear option.
Here you go.
When labeling and tariffs failed, the Southern congressional delegations realized they needed to change the rules of the game entirely.
Yeah.
In the massive, sprawling 2008 Farm Bill, these lawmakers literally slipped a tiny provision into the text. This provision removed the regulatory jurisdiction of catfish away from the FDA, where all other seafood in the entire country is regulated, and handed it exclusively to the USDA.
It is the pepperoni pizza problem, but deliberately engineered for international trade warfare.
Exactly. Why on earth would you move one specific type of fish to the Meat and Poultry Agency while leaving salmon, tuna, shrimp, and literally every other creature that swings in the ocean with the FDA?
To understand the genius of this move, you have to understand the difference in how the FDA and USDA conduct inspections.
Right. Tell us about that.
The FDA relies on a risk-based periodic inspection system. An FDA inspector might visit a seafood plant once every few years.
That's fairly light touch.
But the USDA operates under a continuous inspection mandate. For a meat or poultry plant to operate, a USDA inspector must physically be on the premises observing the process every single day.
Wow, every day.
Yes. The 2008 Farm Bill specifically directed the USDA to create a continuous inspection program that would apply to both domestic catfish and imported catfish.
Let me guess, there was absolutely no scientific justification for this move.
None whatsoever. The Government Accountability Office investigated and found there was no documented history of catfish being particularly unsafe under FDA oversight compared to any other seafood.
It wasn't like there was a catfish plague.
No, it wasn't causing massive outbreaks. The entire maneuver was about forcing Vietnamese exporters to comply with a highly specific, incredibly burdensome, paper-heavy USDA inspection regime.
Because the Americans were already set up for it?
Well, the American farmers already had the political connections and the infrastructure to adapt to USDA rules. But they knew that foreign producers, operating halfway across the world, would struggle immensely to match USDA requirements on a compressed timeline.
So it was a trap.
It was designed to choke off the supply chain at the bureaucratic border.
And the ultimate peak absurdity of this entire saga is how the USDA itself reacted. By 2019, after spending tens of millions of taxpayer dollars trying to set up this catfish inspection office, the USDA literally submitted a formal budget request to Congress asking to defund and repeal their own program.
Yes, that is true.
The agency tasked with enforcing it openly admitted it was a total waste of money, a duplication of effort with the FDA, and provided absolutely no meaningful food safety benefit to the American public.
They begged to stop doing it.
But the political coalition of Southern senators completely ignored the USDA and kept the program alive anyway, because it wasn't about safety, it was about market share.
If we synthesize this whole catfish war, it perfectly illustrates a core foundational concept in political economy, and that is the dynamic of diffuse consumer costs versus concentrated producer benefits.
Okay, that is a very dense academic phrase. What does diffuse consumer costs versus concentrated producer benefits actually mean for me, the person buying groceries on a Tuesday night?
It means the math of political lobbying is heavily stacked against you.
How so?
Think about the cost of this unnecessary USDA catfish program. It costs millions in tax dollars to run, and it results in higher prices for catfish at the grocery store because the cheaper competition is choked out.
Right.
But those costs are spread out, meaning they are diffused, over hundreds of millions of American consumers. It might cost you, personally, an extra 40 cents a year in taxes, and maybe $2 more a year if you occasionally buy catfish.
That's practically nothing to me individually.
Exactly. $3 a year is not enough to make you or any single citizen take time off work, fly to Washington, D.C., and march outside the Capitol in protest. The pain is just too small to motivate action.
But on the other side of the equation.
Exactly. On the other side, the economic benefits of this program are highly concentrated. The increased market share and artificially inflated prices flow directly into the pockets of a relatively small number of catfish farmers in a few specific congressional districts.
So for them, it's a gold mine.
For those 50 or 100 large farm operators, this regulation is worth millions of dollars in pure profit every single year.
Right.
Because the benefit is so highly concentrated. Those producers have every incentive to pool their money, hire high-powered lobbyists, make massive campaign contributions, and ensure their local senators fight to the death to keep the regulation in place.
So the broader public quietly pays the price to subsidize a regional industry's competitive advantage, all while the industry wraps itself in the noble, unassailable language of protecting the food supply.
It's a classic playbook.
It's brilliant in the worst possible, most cynical way. But this use of food safety language as an impenetrable shield for trade protectionism isn't just an American domestic tactic used against developing nations.
Oh, no.
This brings us to the global stage, where the stakes are even higher. The United States and the European Union, two of the largest economies on Earth, are locked in a massive, ongoing, multi-decade philosophical battle over exactly these kinds of standards.
This is where we get into the infamous geopolitical disputes over chlorinated chicken and hormone beef. Let's look at the poultry industry first, because the differences in approach are stark.
Let's do it.
The American chicken industry is a marvel of brutal industrial efficiency. The United States produces over 47 billion pounds of chicken annually.
That is an unfathomable amount of poultry.
It is. And to achieve that kind of staggering volume, the entire system is optimized for speed. At the processing plants, the federal regulatory maximum for high-speed slaughter lines is 140 birds per minute. However, Under recent administrations, many plants have been granted waivers, allowing them to run at speeds up to 175 birds per minute.
I really want you, the listener, to stop and try to picture that physics. 175 birds a minute.
It's a blur.
That is almost 3 full-grown chickens being slaughtered, plucked, and eviscerated every single second on a single conveyor belt.
Right.
At those speeds, according to the source material, cross-contamination is not an accident. It is essentially a mathematical reality. When machines are ripping the intestines out of 3 birds a second, some of those intestines are going to tear.
That's unavoidable.
The fecal matter inside is going to splash onto the meat, onto the machinery, and into the communal chilling tanks. You essentially create a fecal soup.
It's a grim visual, but it's accurate.
So how does the U.S. regulatory system deal with this reality? They don't force the industry to slow down the line. Slowing down means less profit. Instead, they rely entirely on end-of-line decontamination.
Right.
They use highly concentrated antimicrobial chemical washes, compounds like chlorine dioxide, cetylpyridinium chloride, and peroxyacetic acids. They essentially bleach and chemically wash the pathogens off the finished carcass right before it goes into the package.
And this is where the European Union fundamentally diverges from the United States. The EU banned the use of these antimicrobial chemical treatments back in 1997.
Okay, why?
And it's crucial to understand why they banned them. It's not necessarily because European scientists believe the chlorine wash itself is toxic for a human to consume in trace amounts.
So they aren't afraid of the chlorine itself?
Not primarily, no. Their argument is much deeper and more systemic. The EU operates on what is called a farm-to-fork precautionary principle.
Farm to fork?
Yes. Their philosophy argues that if you allow massive industrial producers to just aggressively chemically wash away the contamination at the very end of the line, you completely remove the economic incentive for the farmer to maintain clean, humane, and sanitary conditions earlier in the production process.
That makes total sense.
Why would a farmer spend money to give chickens more space and keep the barns clean if the slaughterhouse is just going to dunk them in an acid bath anyway?
Okay, let me challenge this a bit. Is the EU just being trade protectionist here? Because their farmers couldn't possibly compete with the volume of the American high-speed lines, do they actually have a genuine point about the system?
It's a fair question.
Because to me, hearing this, it sounds like the U.S. strategy is to drive the car as fast as humanly possible, fully acknowledge that you are absolutely going to crash, and just invest billions of dollars in buying really, really good airbags. Whereas the EU wants to just lower the speed limit so you don't crash in the first place.
The airbag analogy perfectly captures the systemic difference. The EU essentially views the American chemical wash as an unfair production efficiency subsidy. The chemicals cover up the sins of overcrowded barns, poor ventilation, and recklessly high-speed slaughter lines.
The Band-Aid.
Exactly. This highlights a massive divergence in the philosophy of risk. The EU requires proof of safety before a practice or chemical is allowed into the food system. The United States demands proof of harm before banning something that is already in use.
That's a huge difference in worldview.
It is. The U.S. Trade Representative constantly, furiously argues that the EU ban is nothing more than illegal trade protectionism dressed up as pseudoscience. The American argument is, look at the microbiological swabs. After we wash the chicken in peroxyacetic acid, the salmonella levels are perfectly safe, the meat is safe to eat. You are just trying to protect your inefficient French and German farmers.
And this cultural clash became incredibly visible and heated during the Brexit negotiations.
Oh, yes.
When the UK was leaving the EU, chlorinated chicken became this massive proxy for British national identity and sovereignty.
It really was the symbol of the whole debate.
The debate in the UK was essentially, are we going to stick with the higher farm-to-fork EU standards we are used to, or are we going to drop our standards to US norms, accept the chemically washed chicken, just to secure a desperate post-Brexit free trade deal with America?
Right.
The British public was deeply opposed to accepting US chicken. It struck a visceral nerve.
It did. And we see the exact same philosophical divide with even harsher economic consequences regarding beef. The U.S. beef industry is heavily reliant on growth hormones.
Let's talk about the beef.
They use 6 different specific hormones, 3 naturally occurring and 3 synthetic, implanted into the cattle to make them gain weight faster and convert feed to muscle more efficiently.
And this saves a lot of time.
It cuts down the time it takes to get a cow to slaughter weight by over a month.
Which, across millions of head of cattle, is a massive economic advantage. You are saving millions of tons of feed and millions of gallons of water.
Huge advantage. But the EU banned hormone-treated beef entirely in 1989. The U.S. fought this ban aggressively through the World Trade Organization for decades.
Because they wanted that European market.
Absolutely. The U.S. argued again that there was no conclusive scientific proof that these specific microscopic residue levels in the meat cause cancer or early puberty in humans.
Proof of harm versus proof of safety again.
Exactly. When the EU stood its ground and refused to lift the ban, the U.S. didn't just walk away, they retaliated. And the way they retaliated is fascinating. They didn't slap tariffs on European beef.
Right. They went after entirely unrelated products to maximize political pain.
Yes, they did.
The U.S. imposed 100% retaliatory tariffs on things like Roquefort cheese, Dijon mustard, French truffles, and Italian cashmere sweaters.
They knew exactly what they were doing.
They deliberately targeted luxury goods produced in specific political districts in Europe to force those local politicians to feel the heat from their own angry constituents. It is bare-knuckle, retaliatory geopolitical brawling, and it's all over the philosophy of food standards.
It's trade warfare, plain and simple.
But it makes you wonder, to understand why the United States government is so deeply, passionately committed to defending these high-speed, chemically dependent, hormone-driven processes on the global stage, you have to look at the people writing the rules. You have to look inside the machine.
You have to examine the personnel. And the text provides a very clear lens for this phenomenon. The revolving door.
Ah, the revolving door.
It examines how regulatory capture isn't just about lobbying from the outside. It's about a continuous personnel loop between the federal food safety agencies and the massive food corporations they are supposedly policing.
Okay, let's unpack this carefully. Because when the average person hears a term like regulatory capture, they usually picture something out of a mafia movie. Cartoonish, blatant corruption. Briefcases full of non-sequential bills handed over in dimly lit parking garages.
Right. Outright bribery.
But the source material argues it's not really like that, is it? It's not explicit bribery. It's more like playing a professional basketball game where the referee currently blowing the whistle knows that next week they're going to be interviewing for a highly paid head coaching job with one of the teams currently on the court.
I want to build on that analogy because it's not just about the future job interview. It's about a phenomenon called cultural capture.
Cultural capture.
Imagine moving to a foreign country. At first you sound different, you act different, but over time you slowly adopt the accent, you adopt the customs, until you don't even realize you've changed.
You just become part of it.
The source material uses the career of Michael R. Taylor as the ultimate pristine case study of this mechanism. And it's important to note, the text goes out of its way not to frame Taylor as some mustache-twirling villain. He is presented as a highly competent professional who perfectly embodies a structural, systemic reality.
Okay, let's hear the resume.
Listen to this career trajectory. Taylor started out as a staff attorney at the FDA in the late 1970s. Then, he left the government for the private sector, joining a prestigious law firm where his primary clients included Monsanto, the massive agricultural biotechnology company.
Okay, so FDA to private practice representing big ag.
Right. Then, in 1991, he returns to the FDA, this time in a much higher position as the Deputy Commissioner for Policy.
Oh, wow.
During this tenure, he oversaw the drafting of highly industry-friendly guidance on genetically engineered foods. Crucially, he also oversaw the FDA's controversial decision not to require the labeling of milk from cows treated with RBGH, which was a synthetic growth hormone manufactured by Monsanto.
Of course it was. It's dizzying. But wait, it doesn't stop there.
It doesn't. After that stint at the FDA, he moves over to the USDA to run their food safety division. Then he goes back to the private law firm. Then he joins Monsanto directly as a vice president for public policy.
Unbelievable.
Then he spends some time in academia at a think tank. And then, in 2009, he returns to the federal government once again, appointed as the FDA's Deputy Commissioner for Foods. He essentially became the nation's food safety czar.
It is a breathtaking pipeline that runs continuously in both directions.
It really is.
And what happens when the personnel loop is this tight is that the mindset of the regulator and the regulated merge. Regulators know, often subconsciously, that they will eventually seek high-paying consulting, legal, or executive jobs in the private sector. The government simply cannot match the private sector's compensation packages for top-tier scientific and regulatory talent.
It can't even come close.
So, whether they realize it or not, this heavily influences their approach to enforcement. They become highly sympathetic to industry constraints. When an industry lobbyist says, "This new rule will cost us millions," the regulator, who used to be that lobbyist, deeply understands and sympathizes with that pain.
They speak the same language.
They favor extended, multi-year compliance timelines. They hesitate to use their most punitive enforcement tools, like criminal referrals, because you don't want a reputation as a zealot when you return to the private sector.
Exactly. It's an alignment of worldviews. And it's not just one high-profile guy like Michael Taylor. The text cites a comprehensive study published in the BMJ, the British Medical Journal, looking at FDA medical reviewers.
What did the study find?
The study showed a massive percentage of them leave the agency to go work for or consult with the exact same biopharmaceutical and agricultural industries whose products they were just reviewing.
It's institutionalized.
And the real-world consequence of this deep cultural alignment, this complete blurring of lines between the government and the corporations, was never more starkly, tragically visible than during the COVID-19 pandemic inside the American meatpacking plants.
Yes, this section of the source text is incredibly heavy. And the text covers this episode with rigorous impartiality, simply presenting the documented timeline of how policy was formed during a national crisis.
A tough read.
In early 2020, as the pandemic exploded, meatpacking plants became massive, deadly hotspots for the coronavirus. The very nature of the work, thousands of people standing shoulder to shoulder on rapid processing lines, breathing heavily in loud, cold, poorly ventilated rooms, it allowed the virus to spread like wildfire.
The perfect environment for an airborne virus.
Thousands of workers were sickened almost immediately. Dozens of plants had to close due to labor shortages and local health department mandates, which caused a severe bottleneck and threatened the national meat supply. Farmers were literally having to euthanize millions of pigs and chickens because there was nowhere to process them.
It was a genuine crisis, with terrible trade-offs on all sides. But the text focuses on how the federal policy response was drafted.
Right,
Faced with these plant closures, what did the industry do? The North American Meat Institute, NAMI, which is their chief trade association, drafted a proposed executive order. They literally wrote the legal text they wanted the President of the United States to sign.
They just wrote it themselves.
They sent this draft to senior USDA officials. And according to emails later obtained through the Freedom of Information Act by congressional investigators, the final executive order that the Trump administration signed just days later closely tracked the industry's draft.
Wow.
The order invoked the Defense Production Act to declare meatpacking plants critical infrastructure, effectively forcing them to stay open and attempting to shield the corporations from state and local health department closures and worker liability lawsuits.
Let me push back here because this is a complex issue. Wasn't the food supply actually crashing? Didn't the government have to do something to prevent meat shortages in grocery stores? You can't just let the national food supply chain collapse.
That is the exact argument the industry made, and the text acknowledges that it is a legitimate, terrifying concern. The threat to the food supply was real.
So they were in a tough spot.
But the crucial point the source material makes is about the mechanism of power. When a crisis hit, the government didn't draft its own independent response, balancing worker safety and food supply. An industry trade group wrote the policy, and the captured agency adopted it almost verbatim, overriding the desperate objections of local public health authorities who were watching their hospitals fill up.
It's the mechanism that's the problem.
Exactly. By the time the first wave of the virus passed, over 42,000 meatpacking employees had tested positive, and at least 200 had died. It is a textbook, documented example of a captured system prioritizing production continuity and corporate liability protection over all other concerns.
It's a chilling realization. But surely, occasionally, politicians look at this deeply flawed, captured system and try to genuinely fix it, right?
You would hope so.
Which brings us to a major piece of legislation. FSMA, the Food Safety Modernization Act. Signed into law in 2011, this was heralded in the press as the biggest, most sweeping overhaul of food safety legislation since 1938.
On paper, FSMA was meant to be a complete paradigm shift for the FDA. Historically, the FDA's posture had been entirely reactive. They were the fire department.
Right.
They chased outbreaks after the house was already burning down, after the salmonella was in the peanut butter and people were already in the hospital.
A little too late.
FSMA was explicitly designed to make them preventive. It legally required food facilities, for the first time, to actually write out comprehensive hazard analysis plans. They had to identify points where contamination could happen and implement documented preventative controls.
That sounds like a massive step forward.
It established the first ever federal standards for the safe growing, harvesting, and packing of fresh produce. And crucially, it finally gave the FDA mandatory recall authority.
Wait. I need to make sure I'm understanding this. Before 2011, the FDA, the primary food safety agency in the United States, could only ask a company nicely to recall tainted food. They couldn't legally order them to pull poisonous food off the shelves.
That is correct.
Are you serious?
I am. They had to rely on voluntary recalls. If a company refused, the FDA had to go through a lengthy, arduous legal process to seize the product. FSMA finally gave them the power to just flip the switch and mandate a recall.
That is horrifying that it took until 2011 to get that power.
So, as a piece of legislative text, FSMA was a massive modernization achievement. But here's the critical, often invisible gap between passing a law and actually implementing it.
Here's the catch.
Congress passed this monumental mandate, but they systematically, year after year, starved the agency of the funding required to actually enforce it.
The text mentions that the Congressional Budget Office and the FDA estimated they needed an additional $400 million a year to successfully implement FSMA.
Which is a drop in the bucket of the federal budget.
Right. They needed to hire hundreds of new inspectors, build entirely new IT tracking infrastructure, and hire scientists to write the complex new rules. But Congress gave them a tiny fractional sliver of that requested budget. So, to use our earlier analogy, we got a shiny, state-of-the-art new law on the books, but Congress absolutely refused to give the agency the gas money to drive the patrol cars.
Exactly. And the result was predictable. Years of grinding delays. Crucial rules regarding agricultural water testing for produce safety or the verification programs for foreign suppliers importing food took 5 years or more just to be finalized as rules, let alone enforced.
That is incredibly frustrating.
And here's the dark, cyclical irony of FSMA that connects right back to 1906. The giant, multinational food conglomerates actually heavily supported the passage of FSMA.
Let me guess. Because uniform federal standards wipe out the messy patchwork of individual state laws they hate dealing with.
That's part of it. But mostly because they knew the fixed costs of upgrading food safety infrastructure to meet FSMA's strict new hazard plan requirements would fall disproportionately on small and medium-sized producers.
History repeating itself.
The giants already had the compliance officers and the capital to adapt. The new regulations acted as a perfect, federally mandated culling of their smaller competitors. It's the 1906 meatpacker playbook, executed a century later.
Wow. Meanwhile, as the agencies wait for funding and the corporations consolidate power, the actual economics of food safety failure continue to ravage the public. The CDC estimates there are 48 million illnesses a year in the U.S. caused by foodborne pathogens.
It's an astronomical number.
48 million. That leads to hundreds of thousands of hospitalizations and thousands of deaths. And the economic cost of that, lost wages, medical bills, long-term disability, is estimated to be between $14 billion and $77 billion annually.
Yeah.
And here is the most important question. Who pays that massive bill?
It is entirely an economic externality. The corporations whose sloppy processing practices or high-speed slaughter lines cause the hazard do not pay that $77 billion bill.
They don't see that cost at all.
The cost falls squarely on the consumers, on the strained public health system, and disproportionately on the most vulnerable among us.
Yes.
The poor, the elderly, children, and the immunocompromised.
We have essentially created a two-tiered system. Affluent consumers can afford to buy their way out of risk. They can pay a massive premium for organic, locally sourced, highly scrutinized food. Lower-income consumers are left completely exposed to baseline industrialized supply chain where these failures happen.
That is exactly right.
So what does it actually look like on the ground when those patrol cars aren't running? What happens when this massive, fragmented, captured system fails the people it is supposed to protect? The source text provides 3 harrowing, detailed case studies that illustrate what I would call the microbiome of regulation, the real human cost of this systemic failure.
These case studies are vital to understanding the stakes.
Let's start with the oldest case, which fundamentally changed the landscape. The 1993 Jack in the Box E. coli outbreak.
This is a foundational case in meat safety history. In early 1993, a massive outbreak of a specific, highly virulent strain of bacteria called E. coli 0157 tore through the Pacific Northwest.
I remember this.
It was linked to undercooked hamburger patties sold at Jack in the Box fast food restaurants. 4 young children died agonizing deaths from kidney failure, and hundreds of other people were severely sickened.
It was a national tragedy.
What this tragedy exposed was that the USDA's inspection system was functionally obsolete. The system relied almost entirely on poke-and-sniff sensory inspections. Inspectors visually looking at carcasses and smelling them as they zipped by on the high-speed line.
Which is useless against bacteria.
Right, that system was utterly incapable of detecting microscopic, invisible pathogens like E. coli.
But the most shocking part of this case study to me wasn't the failure of the visual inspection. It was the USDA's legal and cultural stance before the outbreak even happened.
Yes. The text points out that the USDA didn't even consider E. coli 0157.H7 to be an adulterant under the law.
When scientists and public health advocates warned them about this emerging deadly pathogen in the 1980s, the meat industry and the USDA basically locked arms and said, hey, this bacteria occurs naturally in the intestines of cattle. It's raw meat. It's the consumer's fault if they don't cook their burgers long enough to kill it.
They blamed the consumer.
They literally blamed the victims. They placed the entire burden of pathogen elimination on the 16-year-old kid working the grill at a fast food joint rather than on the slaughterhouse that covered the meat and feces in the first place.
It's astounding.
It took children dying and the resulting massive media firestorm for the public outrage to finally force the USDA to classify E. coli 0157.H7 as an adulterant so they could actually mandate its removal from commerce.
It perfectly tragically illustrates an institutional culture that viewed industry production preferences as legitimate and inevitable, but viewed consumer safety concerns as an unreasonable regulatory burden.
Okay, the second case study moves us from the USDA to the FDA. This is the 2008 Peanut Corporation of America, or PCA, outbreak. And this is a masterclass in what happens when an agency is chronically underfunded and legally toothless.
Yes.
The details from the PCA manufacturing facility in Blakely, Georgia are absolutely stomach-churning. When FDA inspectors finally went in after a massive nationwide salmonella outbreak was linked to their peanut butter, what did they find?
It was a house of horrors.
Standing water on the floor, a leaky roof that was dripping rainwater directly onto the production line, rampant, uncontrolled rodent and roach infestations. And worst of all, the corporate emails revealed that the company was actively testing their own product, finding positive results for salmonella, and then just retesting the same batch over and over again with different labs. They were shopping for a clean result so they could ship the tainted product to schools and nursing homes anyway.
And the reason they got away with this incredibly brazen criminal behavior for so long is that the FDA simply did not have the manpower or the budget to inspect them regularly.
They were invisible.
The state and federal inspectors assigned to that region were responsible for hundreds of different food facilities. A peanut butter plant, which historically had a relatively quiet risk profile compared to fresh seafood or meat, just wasn't a priority in a risk-based scheduling system that was starved of resources. The FDA was essentially relying on the honor system.
And the honor system cost 9 people their lives and sickened thousands. Now, the executives of PCA actually went to federal prison for this, which the text notes is exceedingly rare. But putting a CEO in jail after the fact doesn't change the system, does it?
No. As the source material acutely observes, criminal prosecution's a blunt instrument. It only applies after the bodies are counted and the damage is done.
Right, it's retroactive.
It does absolutely nothing to fix the structural lack of proactive, preventive inspections that allowed the roaches and the salmonella to thrive in the first place.
Which leads us directly to the third case study. And this one is so recent, it is still fresh in every parent's memory. The 2022 infant formula crisis.
Ah, yes.
We are talking about a whistleblower complaint from a former employee at the massive Abbott nutrition plant in Sturgis, Michigan. This whistleblower sent a detailed, terrifying report to the FDA, warning them about falsified safety records, failing equipment, and active efforts by plant management to hide failing microbiological tests from visiting inspectors.
A textbook whistleblower warning.
And what did the FDA do? Because of internal mailroom confusion, fragmented authority between different offices, and a lack of leadership focus, the FDA sat on that complaint for 100 days.
100 days. While millions of babies were consuming formula produced in that facility, the warning sat in an inbox.
When the FDA finally did send inspectors in, they found a history of deadly Chronobacter bacterial contamination. The plant was immediately shut down, and a massive national recall was issued.
But this specific crisis exposed an entirely different, incredibly dangerous kind of structural fragility in the American food system: hyper-consolidation and monopoly power.
Right. Because the issue wasn't just that one plant closed. The issue is that just four major corporations control roughly 90% of the entire American infant formula market, and Abbott alone controlled over 40% of it.
Total market dominance.
When that single plant in Michigan went offline, the entire nation instantaneously lost access to a critical, life-sustaining food supply. Out-of-stock rates hit 70% in some states. You had desperate parents driving hundreds of miles across state lines, trying to buy formula on Facebook Marketplace, or dangerously diluting the formula they had just to keep their babies fed.
It was a nightmare.
It is like balancing a giant crushing boulder on top of four tiny toothpicks. If just one toothpick snaps, the whole thing comes crashing down on the public.
And it is vital to note that this disaster happened entirely within the FDA's jurisdiction. There was no pizza and sandwich confusion here. There was no USDA interference.
Just total internal failure.
It was a catastrophic failure of internal leadership and fragmented authority within the FDA itself, combined with decades of unchecked corporate consolidation that federal antitrust regulators at the FTC and DOJ simply ignored. The government allowed a monopoly to form around a vital food source and then failed to monitor the monopoly's single point of failure.
So if you are a consumer listening to this, if the federal government is failing to ensure basic sanitary safety on the front end, and they're failing to prevent monopolies that crush the supply chain on the back end, where do you turn?
You don't have many options.
You turn to the labels. You try to educate yourself in the grocery aisle. You try to read the fine print and vote with your wallet. But the text shows that the information ecosystem, the very labels you rely on, is just as heavily manipulated and politically captured as the inspection system.
The battle over consumer information is arguably even fiercer than the battle over safety standards. Producers fundamentally despise mandatory disclosures that might make their products look unappealing, complicated, or uncompetitive.
Right, they want simple marketing.
Look at the fight over country of origin labeling, known as COOL. In the early 2000s, Congress mandated that meat sold in the U.S. must have a label telling consumers exactly what country the animal was born, raised, and slaughtered in. Polling showed consumers overwhelmingly wanted this information.
I remember wanting to know that.
But the major multinational meat packers hated it. Why? Because they run highly integrated North American supply chains. They mix livestock imported from Canada and Mexico with U.S. cattle, and tracking all of that segregation cost them money and logistical headaches.
So what happened? Did the meat packers just refuse to comply?
No, they used international trade law. Canada and Mexico took the United States to the World Trade Organization, the WTO. They claimed that the COOL labeling requirement discriminated against their exports and violated free trade agreements. And the WTO ruled in their favor, authorizing Canada and Mexico to impose over $1 billion in retaliatory tariffs on the U.S. if the labels weren't removed.
So faced with that threat, instead of fixing the labels to comply with the WTO while still finding a way to inform the American public, Congress just caved. They quietly buried a provision in a giant spending bill in 2015 that repealed the country of origin labeling requirement for beef and pork entirely.
They just gave up.
The American consumer's right to know where their dinner came from was sacrificed without a fight, just to appease international trade tribunals and the meatpacking lobby.
We saw an almost identical, highly cynical dynamic play out with GMO labeling, genetically modified organisms. For years, the food industry spent hundreds of millions of dollars fighting state-level laws that would have required clear GMO warning labels. Finally, they realized they were losing the PR war, so they went to the federal government to create a preemptive national standard. But the compromise they engineered was brilliant. They didn't have to print their till. Contains bioengineered ingredients in plain, readable English on the front of the box.
Right, they were allowed to use a QR code, which is such a deeply cynical, exclusionary tactic.
It really is.
Think about the reality of grocery shopping. You hide the controversial information behind a digital barcode that requires a smartphone, a reliable cellular connection inside a metal-roofed grocery store, and the time to stand there and scan every single box of cereal.
It's an intentional hurdle.
The only person who is going to do that is a highly motivated, tech-savvy shopper with plenty of leisure time. It keeps the information technically available to satisfy the law, but functionally completely invisible to the average exhausted parent rushing through the store after work trying to feed their kids.
Exactly. It creates an illusion of transparency while preserving corporate opacity. And the text provides a truly fascinating contrast to this weak, easily manipulated federal labeling system. To show what rigorous oversight actually looks like, it points to private, religious certifications, specifically kosher and halal labeling.
This part blew my mind because these are entirely shadow regulatory systems that exist in parallel to the government but have absolutely nothing to do with federal statutes.
Right. They're overseen by private rabbinical organizations or Islamic certifying agencies. And the level of scrutiny involved in maintaining a kosher or halal seal on a product often vastly exceeds what a USDA or FDA inspector actually does on a routine basis.
That's amazing.
These private certifiers require rigorous verification of ingredient sourcing down to the molecular level. They require constant supervision of the processing lines. They require dedicated equipment that cannot be cross-contaminated.
And if a company violates the rules, they don't get a polite warning letter from the FDA. They instantly lose the certification, and they lose the entire market segment.
Because these private systems rely entirely on consumer trust and market reputation. If a kosher certifying agency loses its reputation for absolute rigor, it ceases to exist. Its authority evaporates.
So they have skin in the game.
It is a remarkable, successful example of private institutions stepping into the void where federal oversight is perceived by a community as lacking or untrustworthy.
And that desire for trustworthy, rigorous standards connects perfectly to the broader secular food movement. We have seen an absolute explosion over the last 20 years of organic, farm-to-table, non-GMO, verified, regenerative agriculture foods.
We way out.
People are desperately seeking out these expensive third-party private labels because deep down they no longer trust the baseline government standard. They know this system is captured. But as the text points out, this movement has a massive tragic flaw. It relies almost entirely on the price premium.
That is the ultimate limitation of relying on a market-based approach to solve the public health crisis. The modern food movement essentially allows affluent consumers to buy their way out of the industrial food system.
Yeah.
If you have the disposable income, you can walk into a high-end grocery store and purchase food grown under incredibly strict, humane, ecologically regenerative standards. You can protect your family.
But your purchase does absolutely nothing to raise the regulatory floor for everyone else.
Nothing at all.
The most vulnerable populations in the country are left behind, completely unprotected. They are forced by economic reality to consume the cheapest, most highly industrialized, chemically washed calories available. And as a result, they bear the overwhelming brunt of the externalized health costs, the diabetes, the food poisoning, the chronic conditions that we discussed earlier.
Which brings us to the ultimate overarching question of this entire deep dive. How do we fix a system that is perfectly, intricately designed to be this broken?
Yes, how do we fix it?
Because after reading all this, the fragmentation, the revolving doors, the weaponized bureaucracy, none of it looks like an accident.
It's not an accident. But there are known structural solutions. The most logical, widely recommended reform among independent policy experts is massive consolidation.
Consolidating the agencies.
We need to synthesize the federal food safety functions into a single independent agency. This is exactly what the European Union has done with the European Food Safety Authority. It's what Canada has done. It's what Japan has done.
Makes sense.
You take the FDA's food division, you rip it away from the drug division. You take the USDA's Food Safety Inspection Service, and you strip it of its conflicting mandate to promote agriculture. You combine them to create one unified, streamlined chain of command whose sole, uncompromised mission is public health. The Government Accountability Office in the U.S. has literally been formally recommending this exact consolidation since the 1970s.
But the political obstacles to actually achieving that are immense, bordering on impossible.
Oh, yeah.
The agricultural lobbies, the massive farm bureaus, the multinational meat packers fight this idea tooth and nail every time it is proposed. They absolutely do not want to lose the USDA. The USDA is a friendly, captured agency that is statutorily mandated to promote their economic interests. They don't want to answer to an independent health agency.
It would ruin their setup.
And on Capitol Hill, it's a massive turf war. The Congressional Agriculture Committees do not want to lose their immense jurisdictional power and lobbying influence over food policy by handing it over to the health committees.
So, short of a miracle full consolidation, the path forward requires grinding, difficult, incremental reform. It requires sustained, massive funding increases for preventive laws like FSMA so the FDA can actually do its job. It requires ensuring true independence for government scientists and risk assessors so they aren't pressured by political appointees to alter their findings.
Absolutely.
And crucially, it requires drastically tightening the revolving door restrictions to stop the cultural capture. If you regulate an industry, you should be barred from working for that industry for a decade, not a few months.
I completely agree.
I want to leave you, the listener, with a final, provocative thought built directly on the foundation of the source material we've been unpacking today. We spend so much time in this country fiercely debating the science of food safety. We argue over chemical parts per million and pathogen reduction rates and chlorine washes. But the science isn't the problem. The science of how to keep food safe is largely settled and clear.
It is.
The system isn't broken. That is the hardest pill to swallow. The system is functioning precisely as it was designed to function by the powerful interests that built it over the last century. True reform is never going to come from a better scientific white paper, is never going to come from a polite request. It is only going to come when organized, sustained consumer outrage finally outweighs the financial gravity of organized producer lobbying. Until that day arrives, every single time you sit down to eat, you are consuming the result of a century of political compromises.
It is a sobering, uncomfortable reality to swallow, but it is an absolutely essential one to understand if we, as citizens, ever hope to demand a system that prioritizes our health over corporate efficiency.
I want to be very clear with our listeners about where this incredible, eye-opening wealth of information comes from, because you need to read this for yourself. This entire conversation today is derived from the second book of the 30-volume series, To Preserve, Protect, and Defend the Soul of America, the book titled Volume 2, Fentanyl Nation, Inside America's Opioid Catastrophe, authored by Sue B. Howell.
It is an absolutely essential read for anyone who wants to understand the hidden architectures of American policy and the invisible political economy shaping our daily lives. The depth of research the author presents is just phenomenal.
We enthusiastically announce that the book is now available in all Amazon bookstores across the world. We highly encourage you, our listeners, to go check out the book, get a copy for yourself, and please leave comments and feedback on the platform. Join the conversation. The more we understand these invisible systems, the more power we have to demand better. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.